The screams of dying men mingled with the crackle of flames. As Private Thomas Mitchell pressed his face against the forest floor, feeling the heat of approaching fire lick at his boots, around him, the wilderness of Virginia had transformed from a peaceful woodland into a hellscape where smoke choked the living and flames devoured the dead. It was May 5, 1864, and what had begun as General Ulysses Grant's bold offensive had descended into a nightmare that would haunt both armies forever. 3 days earlier, Grant had crossed the Rapidan River with the Army of the Potomac, determined to finally crush Robert Lee's Confederate forces. The Union commander believed his superior numbers would overwhelm the rebels if he could force them into open battle, but Lee had other plans. The wily Confederate general knew these dense woods intimately, having fought here before at Chancellorsville. He would use the tangled undergrowth, the narrow paths, and the claustrophobic terrain to negate Grant's numerical advantage. As dawn broke on May 5th, the two armies collided along the Orange Turnpike and Orange Plank Road. The wilderness was a forbidding maze of second-growth timber, thick underbrush, and twisted vines that had reclaimed the land after years of iron mining had stripped it bare. Visibility rarely extended beyond 50 yards, making coordinated movements nearly impossible. Artillery was useless in the dense vegetation, reducing the battle to savage close-quarters fighting where men died within arm's reach of their enemies. Lieutenant Colonel James Wadsworth of the 4th Division pushed through a thicket of brambles, his uniform torn and bloodied. Behind him, his men struggled to maintain formation as Confederate sharpshooters picked them off from invisible positions. The forest seemed alive with muzzle flashes and the whistle of bullets cutting through leaves. Men fired at shadows and sounds, often shooting their own comrades in the confusion. The fighting intensified throughout the morning as more units were fed into the maelstrom. General Winfield Hancock's 2nd Corps encountered fierce resistance from Confederate General Ambrose Hill's troops along the Orange Plank Road. The battle lines shifted constantly as units became separated and lost in the undergrowth. Companies that entered the woods together emerged scattered and decimated, if they emerged at all. According to historical accounts from the National Archives, the density of the wilderness made traditional military tactics obsolete, forcing both armies to adapt to a new kind of warfare that would foreshadow the brutal conflicts of the 20th century. By noon, the unthinkable began to happen. The dry underbrush, ignited by muzzle flashes and exploding shells, caught fire. Small blazes quickly spread through the tinder-dry vegetation, creating walls of flame that advanced indiscriminately. On both armies, wounded men who could not crawl to safety faced a horrifying choice: struggle through enemy lines or burn alive where they lay. Captain Henry Abbott of the 20th Massachusetts Infantry watched in horror as flames approached a group of Confederate wounded. Despite being enemies, his men rushed forward to drag the injured rebels to safety. In the wilderness, fire was the true enemy that recognized no uniforms or flags. The acrid smoke grew thicker, reducing visibility to mere yards and making breathing a struggle for survival. The second day dawned with an eerie orange glow filtering through the smoke-filled canopy. Colonel Lewis Grant's Vermont Brigade had spent the night listening to the agonized screams of wounded men trapped in the burning undergrowth, their cries gradually fading into silence as the flames consumed them. The horror of May 6th would prove even more devastating than the previous day's carnage. General James Longstreet's Confederate 1st Corps had arrived during the night, their forced march bringing fresh troops to reinforce Lee's beleaguered army. As dawn broke, Longstreet launched a devastating counterattack along the Orange Plank Road, catching Hancock's exhausted Union forces off guard. The rebels swept forward through the smoke and flames, like avenging spirits, their wild yells echoing through the burning forest. Private Samuel Wilkeson of the New York Tribune stumbled through the chaos, notebook clutched in his bloodied hands. As he tried to document the indescribable horror unfolding around him, trees exploded from the heat, sending burning fragments raining down on both armies. The very air seemed to burn, searing lungs and blinding eyes with tears and smoke. Major General Getty's 6th Corps Division fought desperately to hold the Brock Road intersection, the key to preventing Confederate forces from flanking the entire Union Army. His men had hastily constructed breastworks from fallen logs, but the approaching flames threatened to turn their defenses into funeral pyres. Behind the burning logs, Union soldiers fired blindly into the smoke, never knowing if their bullets found Confederate flesh or merely shredded burning leaves. The wounded presented the most heartbreaking dilemma. Stretcher bearers risked their lives carrying injured men through the flames, often becoming casualties themselves. Many wounded soldiers, unable to move and facing the approaching fire, begged their comrades to shoot them rather than let them burn alive. Some acts of mercy were granted in those desperate moments, adding to the moral burden that survivors would carry for the rest of their lives. Longstreet's assault gained momentum throughout the morning, driving Hancock's corps back nearly a mile. Confederate troops, emboldened by their success, pressed forward through lanes of fire that seemed to part before their advance. But fate would intervene in the most tragic way possible. As Longstreet rode forward to exploit his breakthrough, his own men, confused by the smoke and chaos, mistook his party for Union cavalry and opened fire. The Confederate general fell from his horse, severely wounded by friendly fire, in an echo of Stonewall Jackson's fate at Chancellorsville the previous year. His wounding halted the Confederate advance just as it seemed poised to shatter the Union flank completely. Lee, forced to assume direct command of the assault, could not maintain the momentum that Longstreet had generated. Throughout the afternoon, both armies fought in a surreal landscape of fire and smoke. Trees continued to burn and fall, creating new obstacles and changing the battlefield's geography by the hour. Artillery pieces were abandoned as their crews fled the advancing flames. Ammunition wagons exploded when touched by fire, sending deadly fragments whizzing through the forest. The psychological toll was perhaps worse than the physical casualties. Veterans who had survived Gettysburg and Antietam spoke of the wilderness as their most terrifying experience. The inability to see the enemy, the constant threat of fire, and the screams of burning wounded created a level of trauma that would haunt survivors for decades. Many soldiers simply broke under the strain, wandering aimlessly through the smoke until they were captured, killed, or consumed by flames. As darkness fell on May 6th, General Grant sat outside his headquarters tent, methodically whittling a stick while the glow of distant fires painted the night sky orange. His staff officers watched nervously, knowing that previous Union commanders had retreated after suffering such devastating losses. The Army of the Potomac had lost over 17,000 men in 2 days, with thousands more missing in the burning wilderness. Entire regiments had simply vanished into the smoke and flames. But Grant was not like his predecessors. Born Hiram Ulysses Grant in Ohio, the stubborn general had earned his reputation in the Western theater through relentless aggression. While other commanders saw defeat in the wilderness casualties, Grant saw opportunity. Lee's army had also suffered grievously, and unlike the Union, the Confederacy could not replace its losses. Captain Horace Porter, Grant's aide-de-camp, approached cautiously with dispatches from Washington. The newspapers were already calling the wilderness a disaster, comparing it to the Peninsula Campaign and Chancellorsville. Political pressure was mounting for Grant to withdraw and regroup, following the traditional pattern of Union commanders who had faced Lee before. "General," Porter ventured, "the men are asking what our next move will be." Grant continued whittling, his weathered face impassive. Round them, the sounds of battle had finally faded, replaced by the crackling of fires and the moans of wounded men being carried to field hospitals. The air still hung thick with smoke, and the stench of burned flesh mingled with gunpowder to create an odor that would linger in men's memories forever. "We attack," Grant said simply, never looking up from his stick. The words sent a ripple of shock through his staff. Attack, after such devastating losses, after 2 days in hell itself? But Grant's logic was inexorable. Lee expected him to retreat, as every other Union commander had done when bloodied by the Army of Northern Virginia. Instead, Grant would do the unexpected, advance toward Richmond, forcing Lee to fight on ground of Grant's choosing. The decision would reshape the entire war. For 3 years, the pattern had been the same. Union armies would advance, fight Lee to a standstill or defeat, then retreat to lick their wounds while the Confederate Army remained intact. Grant was breaking that cycle through sheer determination and a willingness to accept casualties that would have appalled his predecessors. The president's burden was knowing that his decision to advance after the Wilderness had indeed shortened the war, saving countless lives in the long run. But that knowledge provided little comfort when he remembered the faces of the men who had followed him into that green hell. Mathematics of war were cold comfort to the families of the 17,000 Union casualties and the 11,000 Confederate dead. General Robert Lee, now in retirement at Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, carried his own ghosts from the Wilderness. His letters to friends revealed a man haunted by what might have been. If Longstreet had not been wounded by his own men, if the Confederate flanking attack had continued, if the forests had not caught fire, perhaps the war might have ended differently. But Lee, ever the gentleman, accepted responsibility for his army's ultimate failure to stop Grant's relentless advance. The widow of Major General James Wadsworth received a letter in 1874 from a former Confederate soldier who had fought against her husband's division in the Wilderness. The rebel veteran wrote that he had found Wadsworth's body after the battle and buried it with full military honors, marking the grave with a wooden cross. Such gestures of respect between former enemies were common. As the nation struggled to heal its wounds, Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross, made the Wilderness a priority in her efforts to locate missing soldiers. Her teams scoured the burned ground for years, identifying remains through personal effects and dental records when possible. By 1876, she had accounted for nearly 3,000 previously missing men, bringing closure to families who had waited over a decade for news of their loved ones. The battle's environmental impact lasted decades. The intense fires had destroyed not only trees, but also the forest's soil structure, creating erosion problems that plagued local farmers for generations. The Commonwealth of Virginia eventually established the area as a state preserve, partly to protect the historical site, but also to allow natural restoration of the damaged ecosystem, according to research published by the Virginia Historical Society in 1879. The Wilderness Battle represented a turning point in American military medicine as well as tactics. The combination of traditional wounds and severe burns forced Army surgeons to develop new treatment protocols that would later prove valuable in treating industrial accidents. During the nation's rapid post-war development, Lieutenant Colonel Amos Webster, who had lost his right arm to a Confederate bullet in the Wilderness, returned to the battlefield in 1878. As part of a government commission mapping the engagement, Webster's detailed reports, now housed in the National Archives, provided the most comprehensive account of troop movements during the chaotic D-Day battle. His work became essential reading for military historians studying the evolution of warfare. The psychological casualties of the Wilderness were only beginning to be understood. As the 19th century drew to a close, what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress was then dismissed as soldier's heart or simple cowardice. Many veterans struggled with alcohol, family relationships, and employment as they tried to readjust to civilian life while carrying memories of unspeakable horror. Reverend Henry Clay Trumbull, a Union chaplain who had ministered to the wounded during and after the battle, spent his later years writing about the spiritual challenges posed by the Wilderness. In his 1880 memoir, he questioned how divine providence could allow such seemingly random destruction. His theological struggles reflected those of many Americans who had believed the Civil War was a holy crusade, but found their faith tested by the reality of modern warfare's brutality. The children and grandchildren of Wilderness veterans grew up in the shadow of that terrible spring. Family stories, when they were told at all, spoke of landscapes from hell, of brave men consumed by forces beyond human control, and of survival that seemed more random than deserved. On May 5, 1914, exactly 50 years after the first shots were fired in the Wilderness, a remarkable gathering took place on the old battlefield. Nearly 300 veterans from both armies, now elderly men with white beards and walking sticks, assembled to dedicate a monument to their fallen comrades. The ceremony would be one of the last occasions when blue and gray veterans could Meet his adversaries turned friends. Former Private Thomas Mitchell, now 82 and bent with age, stood with tears in his eyes as a Confederate veteran he had never met placed a wreath at the memorial stone. The old rebel, who identified himself as former Sergeant William Potts of the 44th Virginia Infantry, clasped Mitchell's hand and spoke words that neither man would ever forget. "We were all Americans that day, brother, all Americans, dying for what we believed." The monument itself was modest, a simple granite marker bearing the names of units that had fought in the battle. But the inscription spoke to something larger than military history, sacred to the memory of all who fell here where fire consumed the wounded and smoke blinded the living. May God forgive us for what we did to each other in these woods. President Woodrow Wilson, himself born in Virginia during the war, delivered the dedication address. His words reflected a nation that had finally begun to process the trauma of its bloodiest conflict. The wilderness teaches us that war is not glory, but necessity. Not adventure, but tragedy. Not heroism, but survival. Those who died here died as Americans, regardless of the uniform they wore. Among the gathered crowd were historians, journalists, and relatives of men who had fought in the battle. Many had come not to celebrate military prowess, but to honor the memory of ordinary men who had faced extraordinary circumstances. The battle had been too horrific for traditional military glorification, but it could be remembered as a testament to human endurance under the most extreme conditions. Dr. Douglas Southwell Freeman, the Virginia historian who would later write definitive biographies of Lee and his lieutenants, interviewed surviving veterans throughout the 1910s and 20s. Their accounts, preserved in the Virginia Historical Society archives, painted a consistent picture of chaos, terror, and random survival in conditions that seemed designed to drive men insane. The last confirmed survivor of the Wilderness Battle was former Union drummer boy Timothy O'Brien, who died in 1936 at the age of 91. O'Brien had been 15 during the battle, too young to carry a rifle, but old enough to witness horrors that shaped his entire life. His final interview, conducted by a newspaper reporter just weeks before his death, included these haunting words. "People ask me about the war like it was some grand adventure. But I tell you true, son, there wasn't nothing grand about watching good men burn alive, while you couldn't do nothing to help them." By the outbreak of World War I, military strategists were studying the wilderness as an early example of warfare's changing nature. The battle's lessons about terrain, logistics, and the psychological impact of sustained combat influenced American military planning. During the Great War, the Army's new emphasis on combined arms tactics and flexible command structures reflected hard-won knowledge from Virginia's burning forests. The wilderness battlefield became part of the National Park Service system in 1927, ensuring its preservation for future generations. Park rangers often noted that visitors behaved differently at Wilderness than at other Civil War sites. The usual tourist chatter and picture-taking gave way to hushed reverence, as if the land itself still radiated the trauma of May 1864. Modern historians continue to study the Battle of the Wilderness not merely as a military engagement, but as a watershed moment in American warfare. It marked the end of romantic notions about combat and the beginning of an understanding that modern war was an industrial process capable of consuming everything in its path. The men who died in those burning woods were among the first casualties of warfare, as it would be practiced in the 20th century and beyond. Today, visitors to the wilderness can walk trails that follow the old battle lines, interpretive markers, explain troop movements and tactical decisions, but they cannot convey the full horror of what happened here. That knowledge lives only in the accounts of those who were there, in the letters they wrote home, and in the silence that still seems to hang over certain parts of the forest where, on spring mornings when the mist rises from the ground, one can almost hear the echoes of voices calling across time, seeking comrades lost forever in smoke and flame. The Battle of the Wilderness had ended not with victory or defeat, but with the understanding that American warfare had entered a new and terrible age. The price of that knowledge was measured not only in the thousands who died, but in the innocents that died with them, burned away like the forest itself in fires that still smolder in the national memory. As per historical documentation from the Library of Congress Civil War Archives, Grant's decision to continue advancing after the Wilderness marked the beginning of the overland campaign that would ultimately lead to Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Throughout the night, Union burial details worked by torchlight to collect the dead from areas where the fires had finally burned out. The scene was apocalyptic, charred corpses fused with melted rifles, skeletons embracing in death, the remains of blue and gray uniforms indistinguishable in the ashes. Many bodies were never recovered, consumed entirely by the flames or buried under fallen, burning trees. Surgeon Jonathan Letterman and his medical corps worked tirelessly to treat the wounded, operating by lamplight in field hospitals that reeked of chloroform and blood. The wounded from both sides were treated together, Confederate and Union soldiers lying side by side as doctors fought to save lives. Without regard for uniform color, burns were as common as bullet wounds, and many men died not from enemy action, but from smoke inhalation and fire. The morning of May 7th would bring Grant's moment of truth. Would he retreat like McClellan, Burnside, and Hooker before him? Or would he prove that this time was different, that the Army of the Potomac had finally found a commander willing to match Lee's tenacity with his own iron will? The morning sun of May 7th revealed a transformed landscape that resembled the aftermath of some biblical apocalypse. Sergeant Major William Thompson of the 5th New Hampshire Infantry gazed across what had once been dense woodland and now looked like the surface of a burned planet. Blackened tree stumps jutted from ash-covered ground like broken teeth. The sweet, sickly smell of burned flesh hung in the air, mingling with the acrid smoke that still rose from smoldering logs and undergrowth. But it was the silence that struck Thompson most profoundly. After 2 days of thunderous battle, the forest had become a graveyard where even the birds no longer sang. Scattered across the wasteland lay the remnants of what had been men, melted belt buckles, charred rifle stocks, and occasionally the ghostly outline of a human form pressed into the ash like some macabre shadow. Grant's decision to continue the offensive sent shockwaves through both armies. Union soldiers, accustomed to retreat after bloody encounters with Lee, could hardly believe they were advancing towards Spotsylvania Courthouse rather than withdrawing across the Rapidan. Many veterans viewed this as either supreme confidence or supreme madness, but they shouldered their muskets and followed their grim-faced commander deeper into Virginia. Lee, meanwhile, faced his own crisis. The Army of Northern Virginia had lost approximately 11,000 men, casualties it could ill afford. General Longstreet lay gravely wounded, depriving Lee of one of his most trusted lieutenants. The Confederate commander realized that Grant represented a fundamentally different challenge from previous Union generals. This one would not be deterred by heavy casualties or tactical setbacks. The race to Spotsylvania began immediately. Lee, despite his losses, moved with characteristic speed to position his army between Grant and Richmond. Confederate engineers worked frantically to construct defensive positions while skirmishers harassed the Union advance. The Wilderness had been costly for both sides, but had not been decisive. The real test would come in the battles ahead. Captain Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. of the 20th Massachusetts, son of the famous poet, marched south with his regiment through countryside that seemed untouched by war after the hellscape they were leaving behind. Fields of spring flowers and budding trees created a surreal contrast to the burned forest behind them. Holmes would later write that the beauty of rural Virginia felt almost offensive. After witnessing such horror in the Wilderness, the psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond its immediate casualties. News of the burning forest and the trapped wounded spread through both armies like wildfire itself. Veterans spoke in hushed tones about comrades who had simply vanished into the smoke, never to be seen again. The randomness of survival in such chaos left many questioning divine providence and military leadership alike. Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top, observed that the Wilderness had changed something fundamental in the men. The traditional concepts of military honor and glory seemed inadequate to describe what they had experienced. This was warfare stripped of romance, reduced to its most primitive and terrifying essence. Men who had dreamed of martial fame now understood that war was simply organized slaughter, with survival often depending more on luck than courage. As the armies marched toward their next confrontation, both sides grappled with the implications of Grant's decision. For the Union, it represented hope that finally they had found a commander who would not be intimidated by Lee's reputation. For the Confederacy, it meant that the war had entered a new and more desperate phase. There would be no more seasonal campaigns with winter breaks for both sides to recover. Grant intended to maintain pressure continuously until one army or the other was destroyed. The wounded who survived the Wilderness would carry its marks forever. Burns left permanent scars, and smoke inhalation damaged lungs for life. But the psychological wounds ran deeper. Many men would wake screaming from nightmares about being trapped in burning forests for decades after the war ended. The battle had introduced a new level of horror to an already horrific conflict. 10 years after the guns fell silent, former Confederate Private Jacob Morrison stood at the edge of what locals now called the burned ground in the Virginia wilderness. The forest was slowly reclaiming the scarred earth, but scars remained visible to those who knew where to look. Young trees grew in unnatural patterns around the remains of their burned predecessors, and occasionally, a spring rain would wash fragments of metal and bone to the surface. Grim reminders of May 1860 for Morrison had returned every year since the war ended, compelled by something he could not name. He was not alone in this pilgrimage. Veterans from both armies made their way back to the wilderness, drawn by the need to process experiences that defied understanding. They came to search for missing comrades, to place markers where none had been possible during the chaos, and perhaps to convince themselves that they had truly survived. The battle's immediate aftermath had shaped the remainder of the war. Grant's decision to continue attacking after such devastating losses had indeed changed everything. The overland campaign that followed saw continuous fighting from the Wilderness through Spotsylvania, North Anna, and Cold Harbor, culminating in the siege of Petersburg. Lee's army, unable to recover from its losses, was slowly ground down by Grant's relentless pressure. Dr. Mary Walker, one of the few female surgeons who served during the war, published her memoir in 1875, dedicating an entire chapter to treating wilderness casualties. Her account, preserved in the Smithsonian archives, described wounds she had never seen before or since. Men burned and shot simultaneously, soldiers who had survived by burying themselves in creek beds, and the peculiar injuries caused by exploding trees and burning debris. The human cost extended far beyond official casualty figures. Entire families were wiped out when sons and fathers from the same communities died together in the flames. Small towns across Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York erected monuments to local boys who had simply vanished in the smoke. Their bodies never recovered. The phrase "lost in the wilderness" entered the American vocabulary as a metaphor for inexplicable disappearance. Morrison knelt beside a depression in the earth where he remembered finding his wounded sergeant, a man who had died in his arms while pleading for water. The sergeant's family had written to Morrison after the war, seeking details about their son's final moments. How could he tell them that their boy had burned alive while calling for his mother? Some truths were too heavy for the living to bear. The battle's tactical lessons influenced military thinking for decades. The role of terrain in modern warfare, the importance of engineering and field fortifications, and the devastating potential of friendly fire in confused situations all became subjects of study at West Point and other military academies. European observers who had dismissed American military capabilities were forced to reconsider. After studying the savage efficiency demonstrated in Virginia's forests, veterans' reunions in the 1880s and 90s were subdued affairs. When wilderness survivors gathered, unlike other battles where veterans from both sides eventually came together to share stories and heal old wounds, wilderness veterans rarely spoke of their experiences. The horror had been too complete, too senseless, for the usual romanticization that time brings to war memories. Morrison rose slowly, his knees protesting the decades since that terrible May. Around him, the forest was alive with bird songs and the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Nature had reclaimed the wilderness. But it could never erase what had happened here. The battle lived on in the nightmares of survivors, in the empty chairs at family tables, and in the understanding that warfare had entered a new and more terrible age.